Right, so Packaging SA has, led by Shabeer, Jhetam, has commissioned BMI for a number of years now to calculate the collection rate of material, packaging and print that is collected in South Africa. And last year that research expanded a little bit into the qualitative space as well. And so I'm honored to present those results on behalf of Packaging SA to you today. And just to give you an idea, it's been wonderful to see what Polyco and Petco are doing, and other industries as well, but somewhere along the line that needs to be measured. Are we improving or not? And so I put the numbers together year on year for that. So if we look first of all, sorry, let me go backwards. It's not going backwards. Sorry. All right, so what I'll tell you is what we started to do was quantitatively, we look at the amount of material that is placed onto the packaging, onto the market that is available for collection. So that means what's been produced in South Africa, what's been imported into the country directly and indirectly, and what's been subtract what's been exported. And then we look at what's been collected, and many of the people in this room help me to put those numbers together, and you calculate a percentage from that. And then importantly, another component to be looked at is what happens to that waste. So we are starting also to quantify how much of that waste goes back into the packaging industry or beneficiation thereof. This is happily moving by, there we go. Okay, brilliant. That's where I am at the moment. And then on the qualitative component, as we spoke to the PROs last year, the EPR regulations has now been in place for 2.5 years. Last year, that was 1.5. And we asked the players in the market, what have the challenges been? What suggestions do you have? What can we look at changing? And that's what I'm going to present a little bit to you today. You've heard some of the challenges from Petco and Polyco. I've spoken to way more than the plastics. I speak to the other packaging sectors as well. And just to get an idea of what commonalities are being experienced. So let's look at the numbers here. And I'm going to look specifically at 2022. 2023 is currently under investigation, so not completely finalized. That's still an estimate. But if you have a look at that, you can see that 4.47 million tons of packaging was placed on packaging and paper print was placed onto the South African market. Then you got about 169,000 tons that comes in through indirect imports. Now, indirect imports is when you go and buy a product from another country. It came in a bottle, in a tin, with in a box, and that also becomes available for collection. And then we subtract what's directly exported, so empty bottles, perhaps looking at things like packed drums, flat pack drums, and also the indirect exports. So what have South African companies exported filled? And there's about 800 or 799,000 tons going out. And that leaves an estimated 3.8 million tons of packaging and print available to be collected. That's quite a number. And who's collecting that, and what is it looking like? Well, overall, I think South Africa does amazingly well. 49.8%, 50% of what is available to be collected is actually collected. That's 1 in 2 bottles. That's half of the industry, and that's really great. Within that, that's 54% for your metals, 55% for paper, 46% in the plastics industry, and 40% on glass. But I must make a note that last year, 2022, the float, I don't know if you know what the glass float is, but that's your returnable bottles. That was refilled last year, or in 2022, and that's not available for collection immediately. Those bottles can round trip for a number of years before they become available for collection. But the number to look at is at 49.8%. Now I'm going to focus here on the plastics industry, and you can see that that 46% I was talking about just now came off the back of a 39% in 2021, going up to 47%, and they're planning to get up to 60% by 2026. And basically, the collection rate will grow faster than the production rate. So each year, each of the industries is planning on working a little bit harder to get a little bit more of what is available. And we've got a note here, plastic packaging is light. You can produce 4 or 5 units or bottles in plastic, which would be the equivalent weight of maybe 1 glass bottle, 1.5 tins, and the like. So they therefore do become a lot more visible on a kilogram per kilogram basis, and that does lead to some of the pushback against plastic as a packaging type. I was really heartened to listen to some of the previous speakers talking about looking at combating plastic pollution, and I know that there's a focus sometimes on plastic production, but there is definitely a place for plastic in the market, both in packaging and other sectors. Let's look specifically then at the plastic packaging industry volume. So plastics at the moment forms about 22% of the total packaging that's available for collection. And it accounts at the moment for 20% of the packaging waste that is collected, pretty much in line with that. Where it does differ, and this comes down to the lightness of plastic, is that plastic packaging accounts for about 45% of total packaging value. That was in 2022, and just a note there, polymers in 2022 were particularly expensive, and I know that that pricing has stabilized, so that 45% has gone down a little bit. On a value basis, that's much more relatable. There it's 20% of the total packaging waste value collected in 2022. And what are the targets? Well, all of the industries are planning to increase their percentage collection, so that by 2026, the industry is hoping to have an industry average of 61%, putting that back into focus with now, this year, last year, the year before, where we're tracking at about 50% or half of all packaging material. I have to tell you that it's a pretty tough target that these companies are setting for themselves. It's hard work collecting it. I think you've seen that in previous talks. Let's look at the actual tonnage, not the percentages. It's great to measure on percentages, but if you look at it in tonnage base, you'll see that there's actually been a 2% decline in the tonnage collected over the last 2021 to 2022. And the main reason for that is that there was a lower production. The market was smaller. The market contracted a little bit. There was less available to collect, and therefore less was collected. And that is a reality as well to be evaluated. Glass grew a little bit. Metal was pretty static. Plastic grew. And I think paper found it particularly tough in that year, but it was a lower than usual production year. Now to bring in the PROs. If you have a look at the PROs, then we're currently in the stage 2.5 years in, where they're looking at increasing membership. Producers have to register with DFFE and to become members of PROs. And at the moment, 75% of the volume produced in the company is covered by members of PROs. That means there's another 25% of the volume produced who have not yet chosen to belong to a PRO. At the moment, of the volume collected by and managed by those PROs, we're looking at 76%, with that expected last year to have increased to 91%. And I think that is as the PROs not only increase their own visibility in the market and what they're doing, but also work with players that are already collecting to take those numbers in and become part of that. But yeah, that's 73% and 78% of PRO members' volumes being recorded. That will remain static until more producers in the industry choose to become part of the PRO landscape. Let's look at beneficiation. Lovely fancy word. What it basically means is we collect the materials and actually use them again, recycle them. So waste beneficiation officially turns waste materials into products of a higher economic value. That involves treating the waste to become those raw materials. And this is not a new thing. There's always been a demand for collected materials in the packaging sector, but certainly not to the degree now being targeted. We want to get better at it. Plastics, we spoke now about the use of rPET entering the packaging value chain. Glass has been doing it for a while, years and years. But just to give you an idea, this is ramping up existing habits. And it absolutely is necessary when you do that to integrate the collected material back into the packaging sector as raw material. It needs to be cleaned, needs to be put back into a format that can be used, but it is necessary. The sustainability of these finite resources won't be managed if we don't do this and increase our need on that. But this requires the development of a market to drive the demand for the collected material. And the packaging industry has historically taken on that responsibility. They've created much of the infrastructure that currently exists that's needed to make recycling a viable component, and were therefore a natural starting point for the National Waste Management Strategy and working with DFFE in order to develop the legislation and the framework that we currently have. So yeah, and packaging manufacturers and converters remain the primary market for collected materials. I'm going to talk at the moment on packaging only, so I've extracted paper print from this. So let's look at the recycled content volume. The volume is relatively similar to what is produced, but if we have a look, the recycled volume in South Africa, we estimated at 1.2 million tons. So of the 1.9 million tons that is collected, 1.2 million is purchased by the packaging sector and reintegrated back into new packaging materials. That's 2/3 of that number. And within that, that does differ through each of the individual categories. So that 1.2 million tons goes back into making the 4 million odd tons of packaging placed onto the market. And that means that for glass bottles, for metal, paper, plastic, on average, 36% of that material's weight of the packaging that you pick up, obviously different by pack type, we're talking here in the aggregate, 36% of that has recycled content. So 1/3 of the material used in the packaging chain at the moment is recycled. So that's at 30% for glass, 7% for metal, 60% for paper, 14% for plastic. And you must note as well that there is a use limitation on some of recycled content in food and beverage products. I think rPET is one of the unique products where it may be used again to create packaging used in the food and beverage chain. But for many of the other products, because of the issue of contamination and keeping the food source safe for us to continue to eat, recycled content may not go into certain packaging types. So yeah, just to give you an idea of where we stand. And then we looked at it on a value point of view, not quite identical. Obviously, your recycled content does sometimes go into your lower valued product. So it's 36% of the volume. We estimate it forms about 28% of the value. And that, to give you an idea, that is the value of the packaging placed onto the market. 28% of that value is attributed to recycled content. All right, now let's look at the qualitative component. That means I got to sit and talk to people, ask them their opinions, ask them to tell me what they've felt about the new EPR regulations when they came into play. And in summary, I think you've seen it today. The industry welcomed the introduction of the EPR regulations, and they've worked with DFFE for many years before their introduction to accommodate the unique South African circumstances. So very much in the same space where you currently are on the global treaty, wanting to make sure that South Africa's unique conditions are taken into account. They were expecting questions to arise, issues and challenges. Nothing works perfectly the first time. And they would obviously need to be addressed because they're only going to be found after the regulations came into effect. The PROs are eager to use the framework. It has provided them with a much bigger base of companies and a different way of doing it, and that's been embraced by the industry. And yeah, the idea was to achieve a better environment for all. So there's a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge in the packaging sector, and a large percentage of that has moved into the PROs, who know the industry, know what works and what doesn't, and are working with people to achieve these aims. And the intention is to achieve the aims of the legislation, which are to, number one, improve the situation at landfills, and also to improve the economic reality for all involved in the waste collection chain. It's a worthy goal, and it's not just because there is a requirement to adhere to regulations. And I think that's clear. This is not a grudge function. There are many people passionate about wanting to improve that are sitting in the industry here. And government and the PROs together have the responsibility to inform brand owners. DFFE, especially initially, did not have direct lines of communication or the knowledge as they've also grown into this function. So much of the weight rested on the PRO shoulders. It still does. It's part of their mandate to let people know about this. And then DFFE is clearly responsible for ensuring registration compliance. If a company chooses not to belong to a particular PRO or to not partake in this, then there is a need to enforce those regulations. It's not the responsibility of the PROs. Any mistakes in this are mine. The people speaking to me know what they were doing. I took the summaries. All right, so what we did on the data sets is I split it into 4 categories. People gave me a lot. They talked, they told me everything, and I split it into 4. The first one is the legal framework. What were the challenges? There's certainly been some benefits, but I've focused on the challenges and the suggestions for change related to that. And I think the biggest challenge is low compliance. That's both through a lack of knowledge and a choice not to comply. I'm not going to register with the PRO. I'm not going to register with DFFE. I can remain hidden. I'm small. I don't want to get involved. It's a schlep. And that's part of it. But there very clearly is also a lack of knowledge. I do research in many other sectors, but I focus on business to business. And I started asking people, what about the EPR regulations? What are you doing to that? And there are a number that look at me and say, what? I don't know what you're talking about. And these are producers, converters, raw material providers across the value chain. There is still a lack of knowledge. And so obviously an increasing awareness and a need to increase awareness is necessary. So I've said they've remained unaware of the regulations. The other part is oversight. A lot of the people I spoke to mentioned that there has not been a visible result of the oversight function. So auditing and compliance monitoring, it's lacking and therefore is not currently a deterrent to not take part in the registration. So one needs to not only increase the awareness of the regulations to producers, but also an awareness of the penalties for non-compliance. And then public participation did not reach all affected industries, and that perhaps needs to be revisited. The packaging sector touches on so many others: waste collection, the scrap metal sector, municipalities, all of which are involved in it, but not touched by the legislation and have no idea of what's going on. So that was the legal framework. Secondly, the PROs and their membership was one of the issues that I categorized. And I think the most important one here, and I think Gesron Polico touched on that, is the lack of PRO registration criteria. there do need to be some criteria set. When you register a school, you register a hospital, you register a manufacturing facility, you need to adhere to a minimum standard. I spoke to all of those 30 PROs that are registered, and saying it in an open forum, there were some of them that registered by accident. They didn't realize that they had registered as a PRO. And therefore, that there really does need to be a bar that needs to be met, so that can't happen. The other challenge that was brought up, and this is one of those where it's both a challenge that is a good and a bad one and needs to be determined, is dealing with more than one PRO per product or waste stream. There's an element of competition there. Competition is often people choose options based on what the reward is, and one would hope that the reward is a well-acting PRO that is fulfilling their mandate. But more often than not, it can come down to which one gives me the least cost, whether that is in the fees, the structure of the fees, or in the admin that I need to do. And that should not be the way in which it is measured, but often that is how producers look at it. What's the biggest benefit to me, not necessarily the biggest benefit for the legislation. So yeah, to deal with more than one PRO per product, and that's one thing that needs to look at. And I'd thought that one of the things that could be a solution there is to perhaps either mandate a single PRO per waste stream, or to encourage the PRO collaboration per waste stream. And that collaboration could just prevent duplication of effort. And then PROs can only audit and work with members. So if a company chooses not to belong, because I'm not the only PRO in that space, there is an allowance for another PRO. This allows for companies to fall between the gap. Two PROs in the same space go to a company and say, please, will you join? And that company says to both, no. And nobody knows that they've chosen and refused that on both bases, unless there's some level of consolidation of that information. And you can see I'm great on information. This is what I do every day. So that comes to a second point. There is no centralized list of producers and importers to manage. So we don't know whether or not there's 6,000 companies and 2,000 have registered, or 2,500 and 2,000 have registered. I'm saying we're probably in the former. And then an unstable membership base. We saw with the numbers that were put up by Polyco that you can actually achieve an over 100% collection rate. But your membership forms your numbers that you submit. And when a company leaves, their numbers go with them to the other organization. And then really important in terms of suggestions for change, to please deregister non-compliant or ineffective PROs and keep the list amongst those that are working. Let's look at the funding mechanism and EPR fees. I think I touched on that when I mentioned the choosing to belong to a PRO because of cost benefits rather than the advantage that the PRO gives. But one of the other things that came up as an unusual, but could have possibly been expected, is there are a number of companies that have their own initiatives collecting both pre-consumer waste, handling waste, transporting waste. And the question there is, if I am now a member of a PRO, are they going to take over this function so I no longer need to spend money on it? And I think that is something that's now facing the PROs that they need to address. And then the other one comes down to, if you're looking at data, especially your small importers that bring in container loads, their ability to know what materials they're dealing with is close to zero. It comes in a package. I chose it because it's a nice sweet to sell. The fact that it comes packaged in a little teddy bear that the kid breaks open, I don't know what that is. And so that maybe we need to look at allowing them a bit of time to develop their methods of information, or to allow combined category estimates. All right, data submissions, physical collection activities. The challenges there, I've mentioned some of them in terms of membership rates. And then I think the double counting and showing a collection rate of more than 100% is possible, and that's just because you measure your collections against your membership base, but the two are actually separate data sets. Minimal separation at source. This is key. It's come up in everything. It's, I think, a part of what EPR expects, but it really needs a bit of focus. And then the industry is still far from implementing a satisfactory waste picker fee or subsidy plan, which probably needs to be revisited to develop that. And then I want to come back to, this isn't AI, this was just us talking and working it through, but it was the same question. What's the proposed outlooks for PROs going forward, given the EPR introduction, if nothing changes? So the outlook at the moment is very dependent on future decisions and changes, and nobody was prepared to say to me, if they do this, this will happen, if they do this, this will happen. The permutations were too great. But we could look at what would happen if nothing changes. So if we do not set criteria for PRO registration, let's take that as number one, then the number of PROs will increase. That's happening. And that will be driven by inexperienced organizations, and that's fine. Let an inexperienced organization come in, learn the ropes. But it also allows for chances looking to make money. And I think there are some that have appeared in this space as well. And then, of course, the accidental registrations. If DFFE does not enforce the regulations at some point, we will continue to have freeloaders. You will continue to have companies that choose not to partake in this because they think they can get away with it. And that will not provide the full benefit that the regulations are working towards. As long as PROs compete on fees and structures and not competing directly on how good they are, then you will get members incentivized to join them because of those benefits. And I think that leads to a level, it's great competition, but what happens there is you get a lot of duplication of effort. You may, both look at one sector and completely ignore another. And then non-compliant producers we've mentioned, but a second point that comes in there is that accurate information will not be available. It's not available yet. Only 73% of the volume is covered. That leaves another 27% out there. I think there's a much higher rate of coordination in terms of the collected volumes coming in than there is of the volumes to be collected, particularly amongst the importer space, who've never needed to consider this, be a part of this, or even be aware of it. They just brought their product in, and now they need to come and play with the rest of us. So if we continue, as is, another risk that I see is a high risk of the loss of the experience and passion that is in the industry. If you fight a losing battle over years, then you get a bit disheartened, and I think that that is something to really consider. When a challenge is found and people expected the challenges, look for the solutions and implement the solutions. And the sooner the better once there is consensus on that. Otherwise, the PROs will become ineffective, and that there's a chance then the EPR fee may be converted to a tax. This PRO structure can be taken in-house, would be run through government agencies. In a long-term plan, that's feasible, but to lose the knowledge that is here and to withdraw all the packaging knowledge in this sector that is concentrated on improving it and take them out and go back to the beginning and rebuild from scratch will set the industry back many, many years. Thank you very much.